Before there was ooh, there was silence. A long, heavy stillness that stretched across a broken world. The air was empty, and the ground was scarred. The remnants of what once was, the tall cities, the bright machines, the voices of humankind, had all been burned away in the flash of their own creation. What remained was a planet that had forgotten how to speak. The Mushroom War had ended not with victory, but with quiet. That quiet lasted for centuries. The world slept. The oceans rose and withdrew like breath, swallowing the ruins, smoothing them into strange new shapes. The forests began to creep across the bones of highways, wrapping metal in roots and turning glass into soil. The air filled again with wind, though it carried the faint scent of ash. The world was healing, but it healed as something different, something that no longer belonged to what came before. The age of humans had ended, and Ooh was only beginning to dream. No one witnessed this rebirth. There were no eyes left to see, no words left to name what was happening. The world simply changed in the quiet way that nature does, slowly, gently, without asking permission. Radiation became magic. Technology melted into myth. The laws of science bent until they broke, and something new began to breathe between the cracks. The world was learning to be alive again, not through logic, but through wonder. Somewhere in that stillness, new energies began to stir. What had once been particles of matter and memory started to fuse into something stranger. The old power of the earth, the same power that once grew forests and carved mountains, woke from its slumber. It did not return as it was. It had absorbed everything humanity had left behind: the machines, the chemicals, the dreams, and the grief. What rose from that fusion was not just nature reborn, but nature changed, a world of consciousness, mutation, and possibility. In the deep cracks beneath the surface, strange forms began to emerge. Slimes that shimmered with sentience, crystals that sang faintly in the dark, pockets of energy that pulsed with the rhythms of thought. The planet itself had become creative. Where humans had built through invention, the world now created through instinct. The result was chaotic, but it was alive. And from that chaos, life began to take shape once more, not as it had been, but as something new entirely. It was not a quick rebirth. The land that would one day be Ooh was first a wasteland, then a swamp, then a forest. Its landscapes shifted like memories trying to remember themselves. The rivers forgot their paths, then carved new ones. The mountains collapsed and grew again. The earth was no longer still. It was dreaming, and its dreams had formed. Time, too, seemed to move differently. What felt like centuries in one corner of the world could pass in a day somewhere else. The planet had slipped out of linear rhythm and into something organic, something alive. And in that slow breathing of the earth, traces of humanity lingered. The old ruins whispered beneath the soil. Machines rusted into fossils. Data turned into song, drifting through the air as faint electromagnetic ghosts. Some of those echoes would eventually become the spark for the new life of Ooh. The world didn't erase what came before. It absorbed it. The remnants of human creation became seeds for a new kind of existence, a world built from memory rather than memory lost. There were places where magic gathered thick, as if drawn to the leftover ruins of civilization. These were the first points of rebirth, the places where life began to bloom again. Out of the broken towers and melted roads came shapes that defied the old categories. Trees that spoke in whispers, creatures that shimmered like thoughts, water that glowed in the dark. The boundaries between matter and spirit dissolved. The world had become fluid, a landscape of transformation. It was in this age of silent reconstruction that the first beings of U began to form. Not yet kingdoms or civilizations, only wanderers of energy and instinct. Some were tiny motes of light, others vast and formless. Some might have once been shadows of humans, changed beyond recognition. They didn't rule the world. They drifted through it like dreams. The planet was full of new life that didn't understand what it was yet. The same confusion, the same wonder that once drove humanity forward now pulsed through the soil itself. The sun rose on U's first true dawn, not as a beginning, but as a continuation. The light fell on ruins and saplings alike, touching metal and moss with equal tenderness. There were no names yet, no kingdoms, no heroes, only the world itself, slowly remembering how to live. The silence that had followed the war was no longer empty. It was pregnant with sound, ready to be filled by laughter, music, and life. The earth had been destroyed by its own creations, and yet it had found a way to turn that destruction into renewal. The scars of the Mushroom War had become the roots of a new reality, one that would soon overflow with colour and chaos. The world didn't need saving, it had saved itself. What humanity saw as an ending was, in truth, the first heartbeat of U. That heartbeat still echoes through everything that came after. Every creature, every piece of magic, every fragment of civilization in U carries within it the memory of that silence, the calm before the story began. It is why the world feels so strange and so alive, why everything in U seems to hum with quiet awareness. The planet remembers being empty, and because it remembers, it cherishes being full. U was not born from order or intention. It was born from survival, the Earth's instinct to live again, to turn its scars into something new. And so, without plan or prophecy, without gods or heroes, the world became U, a place where time could bend, where life could dream, and where everything that was once impossible had already happened. In the long hush after the world ended and before U learned its name, the first thing to return was not language or law. It was pressure, a low, patient swelling beneath the skin of the earth. The old forces that once moved unseen through rock and river began to throb again, as if remembering a song. What people would later call magic was not an intruder. It was a current that had always run through the planet, now made stronger by everything the old age left behind. Radiation did not simply poison the soil. It loosened it. It softened the seams between matter and meaning, letting older currents seep up, brighter than before. Magic had existed long before the last human built the last machine. The world had worn it like an invisible weather, waxing and receding with eras of calm and upheaval. But the Mushroom War cracked the bedrock of reality and thinned the barriers between realms. Things that were once separate began to touch. The sky remembered doors it used to hold. The earth felt corridors it once closed. U was not an invention of magic. It was magic waking up in a changed house and realizing the walls had shifted. At first, the returning power was feral. It did not choose shapes. It made them by accident. Glows pooled in low places like fog. Strands of light trembled in the branches of new forests, then slid down into roots like water. Stones learned to hum. Mushrooms pulsed with luminous breath when the moon crossed their caps. It was not order, and it was not chaos. It was possibility, the way a blank page can tremble moments before the first line appears. Where the old world had gathered its greatest densities, cities, laboratories, towers of glass and signal, the returning power collected as if drawn by memory. Broken antennae became lightning rods for the unseen. Subways turned into luminescent caverns where air sang if you stood still long enough. The ruins did not reject the new current. They received it, and in that receiving the first shape of ooze magic appeared. Inheritance. The future would not be a severing, it would be a graft. Some places woke faster than others. Valleys that had once been wetlands warmed from inside, their fogs learning to think. Mountain ranges with iron veins began to rattle on cold mornings, as if their bones ached with thoughts. On old coastlines, where piers rotted into the sea, light gathered in sheets just below the water's surface, and surfaced as schools of translucent things that glided by intention. The planet was remembering how to improvise. As the pressure built, patterns emerged. Lines of sympathy, invisible to eyes, but felt by anything alive enough to notice, laced the land together. Rivers followed them without knowing. Birds traced them overhead and never tired. These were the first paths of Oozley, not straight like roads but curved like thought, connecting what the old world had never bothered to connect. Where several lines crossed, the air grew warmer. Colours were truer. Sound carried farther. The creatures that drifted through these crossroads learned too quickly and slept too deeply, as if they had lived before. The first keepers of this pressure were not kings or scholars, they were landscapes. Certain forests woke with temperaments, certain plains woke with patience. Certain caves learned to cradle sound and return it as counsel to those who stood within. The land did what caretakers do in the absence of caretakers. It waited and watched. Where beings came, it shaped itself around them. Where no one came, it practiced being a world, so that it would be ready when someone asked it to be one. Among the earliest beings to notice the change were things that had never stopped noticing. Old spirits took a shallow breath after a long cold nap. Some had names once, and had worn them like cloaks. Now they wore the wind. They tested the seams of the new reality, found them soft, and slipped through. They did not return as conquerors or saviours. They returned as weather returns, easing into their roots, carrying whatever the world could bear. With the seams thinned, the distant rooms of existence came closer. The far-off realm, where wishes are treated like craft. The deep-tide plane, where cause and effect take long, slow steps. The hungry dimension that makes endings feel inevitable. All of them pressed closer to the fabric of the healed planet. Doors did not open all at once. Frames grew first. Thresholds formed in the corners of abandoned rooms, in the pockets of root systems, beneath lake ice that never fully froze. The world's map gained depth before it gained borders. Artifacts that had slept through calamity woke next. Not everything precious burns, and not everything old forgets what it was made to do. A book that had taught champions how to lift their hands without trembling felt heat in its spine again. A crown that remembered a promise older than nations shivered in a crate that had never been meant to hold it. A blade dreamed of an enemy the world no longer recognized and woke with a song in its teeth. These awakenings were not loud, they were steady. The tools of the old ages did not return to rule, they returned to remind. The pressure built into habits. Magic practiced being gentle, it practiced being fierce. It practiced both at once. It learned to speak through temperature and colour, through the way shadows lengthened a heartbeat before they should have. When the first beings with a talent for noticing wandered across a warmed lay crossing, they did not find a reservoir to drain. They found a conversation already underway. The world was talking to itself. Anyone else was welcome to listen. The early listeners were wanderers, the new age would later call wizards, though at first they were only creatures who learned to be porous. They felt the pressure like a draft and learned to turn toward it. they discovered that asking the world for help worked better than telling it what to do, and that gratitude taught tricks no spellbook could record. They marked the crossings with stacked stones or strings in trees, or quiet promises. I will bring water here when it is dry. I will leave this place as I found it. In return, the crossings learned their names. This, more than incantation, was the first spell of recognition. Structures rose, but slowly, the way moss makes cities out of stone. A circle of huts gathered on a hill that never struck by lightning because it was busy catching other, better kinds of light. A hall took shape around a spring whose water ran clear even in storm runoff, and the ones who drank there discovered that sorrow left more easily than it came. A tower appeared where no tower should have stood and kept standing because the ground wanted it. These were not capitals, they were listening posts. The world made them because someone was finally listening back. Every new age inherits debts from the last. U's debt was to balance. The pressure did not only carry sweetness. In the same seams where brightness flowed, cold flowed too, the clean, necessary cold that preserves as much as it forbids. Heat woke in other seams, not as ruinous fire, but as living hunger, the urge of things to become more of themselves. Wetness gathered in the low country, learning to multiply itself, to laugh in bubbles and connect all distant places by quiet paths. Sweetness thickened in fields where sugar used to be a commodity and became temperament instead, the will to knit and nurture. These were not empires. They were moods the planet made into regions, and they learned to call themselves elements. The world would later place faces to these moods, but in the first sparks there were only inclinations. A meadow that loved order grew plants in grids for seasons at a time. A far northern shelf learned affection for sleep and drifted off for a century. A basin of mud learned how to celebrate itself and did so without shame, calling to anything nearby that needed a home, needed a laugh, needed to dissolve and start again. None of this demanded belief. It only demanded that you notice. Notice was the key that turned the sparks into structures. Creatures who were patient enough to watch saw that the pressure obeyed certain courtesies. It preferred circles to edges. It liked offerings given without asking for repayment. It punished greed not with lightning, but with emptiness. When a being tried to take more than it could carry, the pressure simply slipped away and returned to the ground, as if to say, I will be here when you are ready to hold me right. Because the seams between worlds were thin, messages passed through by accident. Dreams drifted a little farther than they used to and woke up in other heads. A song hummed under one tree and finished itself under another 2 valleys away. This drift braided into a single organism. Language adapted. Even silence took on flavours. The kind that healed, the kind that warned, the kind that meant, listen, something old is walking past. The first great lesson of the new age was that power was a rhythm, not a throne. You could not really own it, only keep time with it. Those who tried to fix it in one place found their stores turning to dust, or, worse, growing teeth and running off into the woods. Those who learned to lend it found it returning in wider circles. A field watered in drought returned as rain 2 years later to a village you would never see. A kindness paid to a stranger returned as safety on a night you did not know would be dangerous. Learned reciprocity, because that is how its pressure preferred to travel. The second great lesson was that endings did not end things. Old ghosts did not stop walking because they lost their names. They found different shoes. Ruins did not bury themselves. They recruited vines and became hills. Even fear learned a use. It taught paths where not to step. and in teaching those paths, protected animals not clever enough to fear the same edges. This was the curriculum of the first sparks. Not command, not purity, but use. Everything could be used to heal if you carried it gently enough. In the cracks beneath all this, a darker pressure stirred, not a rival force, but the shadow of the same candle. If a world becomes more alive, it remembers that it can die. The knowledge of endings wakes with beginnings. The new age did not create its own doom. It simply acknowledged it. In acknowledging, it kept it at arm's length. The land learned to hold its own absence the way lungs hold emptiness between breaths. This is what made U resilient before it ever grew defenders. The world understood it would fall, and understanding gave it balance. By the time the first true communities formed, the sparks had written manners into the weather. Springs offered counsel at dusk. Northern lights meant keep close to home. A certain kind of breeze tumbling down from a mauve horizon meant change is arriving, prepare to set the table. The early families who built sleeping platforms in the arms of trees did not farm power. They nested in it, trusting that if they stayed polite, the pressure would feed them what they needed to know. It did. Children fell asleep faster. Grandparents remembered things they had not lived through. Arguments cooled in the span of a shared cup of something warm. The world was practicing civilization in its own way and letting its residents take the credit. When scholars finally appeared, the gentle kind who listened before naming, they found a language already written into the land. They did not invent the categories the later ages would mistake for primary colours. They found them under their feet, as obvious as seasons. Cold was not merely temperature, it was memory that didn't leak. Heat was not merely flame, it was intent that could not be talked out of itself. Wet was not merely water, it was the urge to connect, to carry, to dissolve edges so that two could become one. Sweetness was not merely sugar, it was the will to gather and tend. These ideas placed their hands on the scholars' shoulders and steered them to good work. Build kitchens, build hearths, build places to rest. It was the most practical magic of all. Out in the wider world, other rooms drew near and left fingerprints. A chamber where wishes are woven pressed its palm against the fabric of reality and left a warmth there, faint but steady, the way a friend's hand stays on your back even after they pull away. A hungry intelligence that specializes in unraveling sang its one note at the edge of hearing. U learned to keep its harmonies tuned enough that the song could not catch. Neither visitor owned the land. Both left marks the world could use, reminders of what to guard against, and proof that the fabric was strong enough to receive a touch without tearing. As the first sparks settled into habits, responsibility emerged. Magic is not a gift you receive. It is a neighbour you live beside. The early keepers learned to sweep their thresholds, not out of superstition, but out of courtesy. They learned that promises are themselves a kind of architecture, and that breaking them is like removing a beam from a roof. Towns rose around good promises. Roads formed between places that kept them. This is how U wrote law, before it wrote laws, with behaviour that made the land relax instead of flinch. Children born into this weather did not know they were miraculous. They learned to spot the warmer patches on the ground and to sit there when they were sad. They learned which stones held songs in the afternoon and which held quiet in the morning. They learned that if they spoke kindly to a stream, it would speak kindly back by not freezing the bridge the night before a market day. Their parents did not call this sorcery. They called it being decent. The line between decency and magic never grew very high in U, and that, more than any amulet, is why the age endured. By the time the first banners were hung, the pressure had become a climate, not dramatic, not shocking, but dependable in its strangeness. Small rituals made it smoother. Feast days thanked it for holding, days of rest allowed it to refill. Mourning days acknowledged its shadow so that joy could grow straight. The world did not ask to be worshipped, it asked to be kept company. The first sparks of magic were not fireworks, they were habits. They taught Oo to hum before it sang. What began as a pressure under the skin matured into the pulse that would carry the age. The land had its moods and its guardians. The rooms beyond had their distances respected and their doors kept clean. The artifacts that remembered their work kept doing it, now held by hands that understood the difference between using and depending. Oo did not master its magic. It befriended it, and in that friendship the world reached a threshold. The sparks had become embers. The embers were hot, enough to cook with, warm enough to share, bright enough to read by. The next thing that would come, kingdoms, teachers, fools, defenders, tricksters, saints, and those who were all of the above, would only arrive because the land had made itself ready to host them. The page was no longer blank. It was ruled, lit, and patient. The story could begin without breaking the paper. By the time the first shapes of civilization began to coalesce, Oo was no longer a newborn world. Its pulse had steadied. The wildness of raw creation had softened into pattern. Magic had learned rhythm, and rhythm had learned restraint. The great elemental forces, fire, ice, slime, and candy, were no longer whispers beneath the soil, but voices that could be felt in the wind, the water, and the ground itself. They were not rulers yet, but presences, shaping the land by being it. The element of fire stirred first. It was born in the cracked plains and volcanic ribs that had once been the scars of war. Heat rose from the earth, not as destruction, but as hunger. The hunger to become, to forge, to change. Flames licked across barren rock, leaving behind strange new minerals, glowing seeds, molten veins that cooled into crystal. Life that thrived in heat learned movement through restlessness. The creatures that crawled from that fire carried within them the first spark of ambition, the will to make and to break. Opposite the fire, deep in the shadows of the world's northern reaches, ice awakened, not in opposition, but in answer. Where fire burned for motion, ice settled for memory. It gathered around the oldest remnants of the old world, skyscraper bones buried in permafrost, data frozen in shards of glass. Ice preserved what the rest of the earth forgot. It remembered the shape of the human face long after flesh had vanished. Its stillness was not lifelessness, it was patience. The creatures that followed its call learned endurance and quiet. They carried within them the understanding that to hold something long enough is to protect it. Between these two great moods, the element of slime rose from the softened valleys and riverbeds. It was the planet's laughter, the overflow that could not be contained. Slime spread where the other elements met. It connected instead of dividing. It was the essence of renewal. What burned turned to ash, what froze turned to meltwater, and the slime gathered it all, turning waste into nourishment. Where slime ruled, life multiplied without order, but never without joy. It was chaos, but a friendly one, a reminder that nothing truly ends if it can dissolve first. And from the places where sunlight lingered the longest, where fruits fattened and flowers refused to wilt, came the gentlest element, candy. Its sweetness was not sugar, but empathy. It grew from the soil's need to comfort itself after centuries of silence. The air in these lands carried warmth even when cold should have ruled. The first organisms that formed there shared resources instinctively, blending and repairing each other. Candy was the pulse of unity, the instinct to nurture, to rebuild, to to belong. These four forces formed the first harmony of U. They were not gods or monarchs. They were temperaments of the world, the moods that had learned to coexist. Fire taught movement, ice taught patience, slime taught adaptation, and candy taught care. Together, they created balance, though that balance was fragile and in constant motion. Each kept the others in check. Fire melted ice, but ice cooled fire. Slime dampened flame, but flame dried slime. Candy grew in their wake, tempering excess with gentleness. U's first piece was not absence of conflict. It was the understanding that every contradiction was necessary. As the elements grew stronger, they began to shape beings in their image. The early elementals were not yet the great rulers of later ages. They were pure embodiments, forms sculpted by will rather than blood. They emerged from the land like reflections taking form. The fire elemental danced in the heat haze above volcanoes, flickering between fury and fascination. The ice elemental stirred in frozen caverns, whispering the world's earliest songs. The slime elemental flowed across borders, carrying laughter through valleys. The candy elemental hummed in meadows, scattering seeds that would later bloom into life capable of kindness. These primal beings did not speak to one another directly, but their movements composed the first music of U. When fire surged, ice answered with silence. When slime spilled over, candy regrew what was lost. Their harmony created the first weather, the first seasons, the first sense of time. Daylight itself began to follow the rhythm of their balance. The world had found a way to breathe, inhale through creation, exhale through stillness. It was from this elemental balance that U's earliest intelligent creatures arose. Some were drawn from the remnants of old humanity, mutated, softened, reshaped by magic into new forms. Others were born directly from the elements themselves. These new beings did not separate themselves from the land. They were the land. Firefolk glowed with the same energy that pulsed beneath the earth. Ice spirits shimmered like frozen memory. Slime beings moved as extensions of rivers and wetlands. And the first candy, creatures fragile, warm, and endlessly optimistic, embodied the world's newfound tenderness. In these early centuries, U was a mosaic of living moods. Each region thrived according to its nature. Firelands burned and healed in cycles, never collapsing fully, but never staying still. The ice fields expanded and retracted, preserving fragments of history in perfect clarity. The slime marshes bubbled with excess, life and decay indistinguishable, every boundary porous. And the candy meadows shimmered with sweetness, their air thick with compassion, so tangible it could heal small wounds. The first travellers to cross between these lands discovered that each element had its own form of wisdom. In the Firelands, they learned courage, to walk through change without fear. In the ice, they learned reflection, to hold still long enough to understand. In the slime marshes, they learned humility, that life was meant to be shared, not controlled. And in the candy meadows, they learned empathy, that survival alone was never enough without connection. These lessons were not taught through speech, but through experience. The land itself was the teacher. Over time, the boundaries between the elements began to blur. Fires cooled into embers, then hardened into crystals. Melted ice gave birth to rivers that flowed into candy fields, where flowers absorbed their shimmer. Slime carried nutrients from one realm to another, binding all things in subtle unity. U's balance depended on this circulation. When one element weakened, the others responded, not to conquer, but to compensate. The entire planet functioned like a living organism, every region a vital organ, every current a pulse. But even in harmony, tension lingered. Fire's hunger sometimes grew too strong and scorched the ground it loved. Ice's solitude deepened into melancholy. Slime's playfulness tipped into excess, consuming instead of creating. Candy's compassion threatened to smother, to make everything too soft, too safe. The world learned early that perfection was unsustainable. Ooh's beauty came from imperfection, from the way every imbalance led to renewal. This was the rhythm that would one day define every era of its history. The rise of the elementals marked the world's first attempt at identity. Before kingdoms, before rulers, before heroes, there was balance and the effort to maintain it. The elements did not yet war for dominance, but their friction began to shape the stories to come. It was from their collisions that new phenomena were born: storms, frost, lightning, and growth. Even conflict had purpose. Without fire's impatience, the ice would never crack to let rivers flow. Without ice's restraint, fire would consume itself. Without Slime's laughter, Candy's peace would grow stagnant, and without Candy's kindness, Slime's chaos would lose direction. In this early balance, Ooh learned what all living things would later rediscover: that survival is not about strength, but about connection. The elements did not endure because they were invincible. They endured because they needed one another. Each could only exist through the others. This truth became the world's first moral, one that would echo through its history long after the elements took form in rulers and their kingdoms. As ages passed, the elementals began to retreat deeper into their realms, content to watch the surface world evolve. They had given Ooh its heartbeat, its rhythm of balance, and its endless cycle of renewal. In their absence, smaller beings took up their lessons and began to build not just with stone and wood, but with intention. The first true civilizations of Ooh were not born from conquest or invention, but from imitation. The creatures of the land sought to live as the elements did, in harmony, in tension, in perpetual transformation. And so, Ooh entered its first true age of growth. The fires dimmed, but never died. The ice melted, but never vanished. The slime thickened, but never stagnated. And the candy bloomed, but never spoiled. The land had found its balance, and the beings who called it home learned to shape themselves around that pulse. It was the quiet before the rise of ambition, the moment where creation, for once, was content simply to exist. When the elements settled into balance and the wildness of early magic softened into rhythm, Ooh entered a period of awakening. It was no longer a land of pure instinct, nor yet a world of reason. It was a world learning to speak, not through words, but through creation. Across its vastness, new forms of life began to gather, to shape, to organize. From that slow and patient motion, the first civilizations emerged. They did not begin as kingdoms. There were no thrones or armies, no banners or laws. They began as communities, small, scattered, often accidental. Groups of beings drawn together by survival, curiosity, and the faint memory of togetherness that lingered from the age of humanity. The world itself guided them. Forests offered shelter, rivers gave direction. Magic hummed softly in every breeze, not as power, but as companionship. The first settlements grew where the elements met. In the valleys where fire's warmth melted ice, where water from the mountains nourished candy meadows, where slime flowed freely to connect everything. These borderlands were fertile, but more than that, they were balanced. Life born here carried within it the mixed essence of the world, creatures of dual nature, half instinct and half reflection. From their harmony came intelligence. These early beings learned by imitation. They watched how the world maintained its balance, how the flames burned without consuming, how ice held without trapping, how candy gave without depleting. They built accordingly. Their shelters were not meant to last forever. They grew from living roots, from stones that hummed with light, from rivers that curved to embrace them. Everything they made breathed. U's first architecture was alive. Trade was simple and sacred. A traveller might carry a cup of enchanted water to a village that had only dry stone, and in return receive a flame that never went out. These exchanges were more than commerce. They were ritual, reminders that giving and receiving were parts of the same act. Through these rituals, the early peoples learned trust. They began to travel, to share stories, to follow the ley lines of magic that pulsed beneath the soil. Every path they walked reinforced the pulse of the world, turning U's scattered lands into a single living network. The first form of leadership was not hierarchy, but stewardship. Certain beings, the ones who could sense when the balance tilted, became keepers of their regions. They were not rulers, but listeners. They learned to hear when the rivers whispered of drought, when the forests sighed with weariness, when the air trembled with unease. These keepers guided their people not through command, but through awareness. They understood that U itself was the true ruler, and they were its caretakers. Some of these keepers began to experiment with the language of creation. Using the subtle harmonies of magic, they learned to mold energy into form, sound into structure. The first true spells were born, not tools of domination, but extensions of empathy. A spell to soothe a storm, to heal a branch, to quiet a restless fire. Magic became a form of dialogue, a way to negotiate with the world rather than to control it. Out of these acts of listening came the first cultures. Each region developed its own way of honouring the forces that shaped it. In the Firelands, artists carved sculptures from cooled magma, believing that to create was to honour the flame's desire to transform. In the north, ice dwellers built labyrinths of light within glaciers, preserving songs and memories in frozen chambers. In the slime marshes, communities built their homes upon shifting ground, celebrating the joy of impermanence. In the candy meadows, gatherings centered around sharing sweetness, an act that symbolized love and continuity. Despite their differences, these early civilizations shared a common belief. The world was alive, and life was a conversation. Nothing existed in isolation. To act was to ripple across the whole. This understanding kept them humble. Their technologies, if they could be called that, worked with the grain of the land, never against it. Windmills powered by song, bridges grown from living vines, lights drawn from captured moonbeams, all reflected the same principle, that creation was a form of care. In time, U began to glow. Villages dotted the landscape like stars, their fires flickering gently against the endless night. Paths of light connected them, trails of energy formed by travel, trade, and trust. The world was entering a golden age, not of conquest or innovation, but of balance. For the first time since the world's rebirth, existence felt peaceful. Yet within that peace, change stirred. Harmony, by nature, creates its own tension. Where there is balance, there is also the temptation to test it. Some among the keepers began to wonder if they could do more than listen, if they could shape the world's rhythm themselves. Curiosity led to experimentation. Small spells became greater ones. The quiet conversation between life and land became, in places, a debate. Not all experimentation led to harm. The first scholars of magic discovered patterns in the ley lines, intersections of power where thought could alter reality. By studying these intersections, they began to understand the mechanics of existence itself. From this came art, philosophy, and the earliest sciences of U. They learned that intention was the strongest force in the universe, that belief could move mountains and mend hearts alike. But with knowledge came pride. Some civilizations began to define themselves not by their relationship with the land, but by their mastery over it. Towers rose where once there were trees. Rivers were redirected to serve grand designs. The old songs of gratitude were replaced by spells of command. For the first time since U's birth, the world began to feel strain. The ley lines twisted, the balance faltered, and magic that had once been a gentle hum grew restless. Still, even in their hubris, the early peoples did not lose their reverence completely. Many believed their work was in service of U, that by harnessing its power, they were helping it evolve. And perhaps, in some small way, they were right. For even when the balance tilted, U adapted. It absorbed the scars, the experiments, the mistakes. Each act of excess became part of its memory, a lesson written into its soil. In the heart of these early civilizations, one figure began to rise above the rest, a being of curiosity and compassion who sought to understand not just magic, but meaning itself. Their studies would lead to discoveries that would echo for millennia, shaping the destiny of U and all who lived within it. But that story was still to come. For now, the world stood on the edge of its first great transformation. The civilizations had grown, the balance had shifted, and the conversation between life and land had become a song, sometimes harmonious, sometimes discordant, but always alive. U had taken its first steps toward the complex, chaotic, and beautiful age that would define its future. Every world that grows from balance eventually creates conflict, not from hatred, but from the restless search for purpose. When U's early civilizations reached their first height, that restlessness began to stir. The age of harmony had made life easy, almost too easy. Magic provided food and warmth. The elements kept the land stable. The seasons flowed in predictable patterns. But comfort can make the spirit hungry in other ways. The people of U began to look beyond survival. They began to wonder what they were for. It started with the builders. Those who could shape magic into form began to dream larger. Villages became cities, and cities became symbols of ambition. Towers climbed toward the sun, bridges spanned rivers that had never been crossed, and lights burned through the night simply because they could. For the first time, U saw creation for its own sake, art and architecture made not to honor nature, but to rival it. These works were magnificent, but they carried a quiet arrogance. The world that had once been a teacher was now a resource, and in that change, the first shadow of pride fell across the land. Out of that shadow rose a new kind of being, the hero. They were born not from power, but from longing. In a world where peace had dulled the edges of purpose, heroes sought something to struggle against. Some fought to protect, others fought simply to feel alive. Their stories became the myths of the forgotten age, tales of courage, foolishness, and the search for meaning in a world that no longer needed saving. The first heroes were wanderers. They walked the ley lines, following the hum of the world's energy, listening for imbalance. Some were scholars turned explorers, others creatures born of magic, who sought to understand their own existence. Their journeys connected the scattered civilizations, stitching the world together through stories. When they passed through a village, they left behind wisdom, relics, or sometimes only questions, but always change. U began to move again, its pulse quickening with adventure. These heroes did not wield swords, forged in hatred, or cast spells of domination. Their battles were often internal, against pride, fear, or the temptation of immortality. They faced creatures born from the distortions of magic itself, beings of shadow and reflection, accidents of creation. Some were corrupted fragments of elemental energy, others remnants of the old human world twisted into new forms. The heroes called them the unformed, life without purpose, power without direction. Each encounter taught the same lesson, that creation without meaning leads to chaos. The legends of this age tell of one who carried a lantern that could illuminate truth, another who sang songs that healed the land, and a third who built a bridge between dreams and waking life. Whether they were individuals or symbols, none can say. What matters is the message they left behind, that power must serve, understanding, not the other way around. Their deeds were recorded not in books, but in landscapes, valleys shaped like crescents, stones that glowed faintly at twilight, rivers that whispered names when the wind blew right. All were said to mark where heroes once walked. In the Firelands, a figure known only as the Red Pilgrim carried a shard of living flame that could burn lies but not flesh. They taught that truth is not something to wield, but something to endure. In the frozen north, a wanderer wrapped in light blue robes listened to the ice itself, recording its songs in crystal, preserving the memories of a world that refused to forget. And in the slime marshes, a collective of shapeshifters turned their bodies into stories, merging with the land to record history in living form. They called themselves the Rememberers. For a time, these heroes united the scattered peoples of U, not through conquest, but through example. They taught that every creature, no matter how small, carried the same spark that had once reignited the world after the war, the will to live, to connect, to create. But as centuries passed, their lessons began to fade. Memory in U has always been fluid. What one age calls truth, another calls myth. The heroes' names dissolved into legend, their deeds into song, their wisdom into whispers. As their stories faded, a new kind of power rose to fill the void. The great wizards, once humble scholars, began to see themselves as inheritors of the hero's mantle. But where the heroes had sought meaning, the wizards sought mastery. They delved into the nature of magic, not as conversation, but as control. The ley line crossings that had once been sacred became laboratories. The gentle rhythms of U's magic were stretched, forced, and harnessed. The world responded, not with anger, but with imbalance. The heroes of old would have understood the danger, but they were gone, or perhaps simply transformed, existing now as the spirits that whispered warnings in the dreams of those who listened. Some believe that when a traveller in U feels sudden courage or unexpected compassion, it is the echo of those first wanderers, the forgotten heroes, lending their strength for a moment. U remembers, even when its people forget. This was the age when the world first learned what ambition costs. The rise of civilization brought comfort, but comfort bred pride, and pride disrupted the delicate dance that had kept U whole. The elements began to grow restless again. Fire's hunger flared without restraint, ice deepened into isolation, slime overflowed into chaos, and candy's warmth curdled into control. The balance trembled, and with it the peace of the world. But even in its tremors, U endured. The memory of the heroes, though dim, still pulsed beneath the surface. Their stories had become part of the world's DNA, coded into rivers, winds, and dreams. Every generation that followed, whether they knew it or not, inherited their purpose: to seek balance not through dominance, but through understanding. That ideal would resurface again and again, in different forms, through different faces. The forgotten age of heroes ended not with destruction, but with forgetting. Their monuments sank beneath forests, their songs became echoes, their symbols turned to dust. Yet, U itself remained their memorial. The harmony they fought to preserve would falter and fall, but never fully vanish. It would wait, patient and eternal, for new heroes to rediscover what the first ones had already learned, that the greatest act of creation is not building a world, but keeping it alive. After the heroes vanished into myth, and the age of balance began to fade, U entered a new kind of dawn, bright, glittering, and dangerous. The silence left by the heroes' disappearance was quickly filled by those who believed they could continue their work in a different way. These were the wizards, the scholars, and the seekers who wanted not only to understand magic, but to reshape it. They saw the world not as a teacher, but as a vast experiment. And, for a time, their age was one of wonders. Magic had always been alive in U, but in this era it began to take structure. The wizards built towers along the ley lines, each one a node in a network that spanned the continents. They learned to measure what could once only be felt. They mapped energy, bottled storms, harvested light from auroras, and coaxed whispers from the dead air of the void. Theirs was an age of progress, not industrial, but arcane. It glittered with invention, and it hummed with power. Yet beneath that, brilliance lay in patience. The wizards of early U did not want to simply coexist with the forces of the world. They wanted to command them. Some sought immortality, others omniscience. The line between curiosity and obsession blurred. In their pursuit of understanding, they began to unmake the harmony that had sustained them. They treated the world as a machine made of secrets, rather than a living thing made of balance. Still, not all were driven by pride. Some wizards truly sought wisdom, not control. They gathered in hidden circles to study the old ways, the language of rivers, the memory of stones, the breath of the wind. These quiet scholars became the counterweight to the ambition of their peers. They recorded what the reckless would destroy, preserving fragments of truth for a future that might yet remember. But in their secrecy, they became invisible, and history often remembers noise better than silence. The most ambitious of the wizards built towers that reached the clouds, thin bridges between the physical and the unreal. These towers served as laboratories, temples, and prisons all at once. Within them, experiments blurred the line between creation and destruction. Elemental energy was distilled, shaped, and fused. Spirits were summoned, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. Some of these experiments succeeded, giving birth to creatures of great beauty and kindness. Others failed, leaving behind scars in the land, places where reality still trembles, where the laws of the world hesitate to settle. As their knowledge deepened, the wizards began to alter themselves. Some extended their lifespans, binding their essence to crystals, stars, or words of power. Others transformed their bodies to better channel the elements they studied. Their humanity, already faint, became a memory. They were not gods, but neither were they mortal. They became something in between, beings of immense ability and endless loneliness. Among these mages were those who would later shape the world's history even after their time had passed. There were wizards who built realms inside dreams, others who vanished into their own creations, and a few who left behind apprentices that would one day change the course of U entirely. But this was still an age without heroes, only inventors, explorers, and wanderers who mistook knowledge for purpose. The world shimmered with their wonders. Floating citadels drifted on magnetic winds. Forests of glass trees sang in harmonic tones when storms rolled overhead. The oceans glowed from beneath, illuminated by vast underwater cities powered by bioluminescent magic. There were roads that remembered every traveller's footsteps, doors that opened only for those who dreamed them, and stars that could be plucked from the sky if one knew the right incantation. To live in this age was to live surrounded by miracles. But every miracle carried a shadow. The more the wizards manipulated the ley lines, the more unstable the world became. Rivers flowed against gravity. Time stuttered in the corners of ancient ruins. The moon shone too bright, then too dim. The elements, once in quiet harmony, began to protest. Fire surged without warning. Ice crept further south. Slime overflowed into once stable lands, and candy wilted into bitterness. The natural pulse of Oo was faltering, stretched thin by those who thought they could improve perfection. Some wizards noticed. They saw cracks forming in the fabric of reality, fractures that reached deep into the unseen layers beneath Oo. They called these fractures veins of possibility, believing they could harness them. But they were wrong. What they found were not veins, but wounds. The world was bleeding energy faster than it could heal, and the magic they drew from it was no longer pure. It came tainted with echoes of something older, a power that predated even the elements. This was the beginning of the first true corruption in Oo. From those unseen depths came whispers, promises, and visions. Magic that spoke, magic that wanted. Some wizards resisted, others listened. The ones who listened were changed. Their eyes darkened with light that was not their own. Their voices echoed in ways that never stopped. They began to speak of a new kind of magic, one that could erase limits, one that could make a single will greater than the world itself. And in their arrogance, they believed it was theirs to command. But the world has a way of reclaiming what it lends. Those who reached too far began to vanish. Towers collapsed into themselves, leaving behind craters that pulsed faintly like open eyes. The ley lines twisted, cutting off entire regions from the flow of magic. The few wizards who survived began to scatter, their golden age fading into ruins and myth. The wonders they had built turned to relics, their power sealed or forgotten. Out of that ruin, smaller figures emerged, apprentices, wanderers, and survivors who carried fragments of the lost knowledge. Some used it to heal, others to harm, but all carried the same truth in their bones, that magic, when treated as possession, devours the one who holds it. The age of wizards had given Oo its greatest beauty and its deepest wounds. It had shown that wisdom and destruction often wear the same face, yet even in its fall, the age left gifts. The ruins of the old towers became seeds of wonder. Fragments of the wizards' experiments evolved into new forms of life, strange, gentle beings who knew neither ambition nor sorrow. The land healed around them. The rivers reclaimed the valleys, the forests regrew, and the balance, though altered, began to restore itself. The world never truly breaks, it simply changes shape. The wizards faded into legend, their names becoming as distant as those of the heroes who came before. But the echoes of their age persisted. The artifacts they left behind, crowns, books, weapons, and words, would one day return to shape the lives of others. Their mistakes would become lessons, their brilliance would become myth, and their loneliness would echo through Oo like a warning. That power without harmony always ends in silence. The age of wizards and wonders had ended. What came next would be slower, gentler, and stranger, an age of recovery, of memory, and of stories whispered by the world itself to those who could still listen. Oo was learning again, as it always did, how to heal from its own brilliance. The ruins of the wizards' towers cooled slowly. For decades, maybe centuries, the air above them shimmered with the last traces of their spells, silent reminders of the age that had just ended. The land around those ruins began to grow again. The forests crept back over the shattered stone. Rivers reclaimed the valleys that had been carved apart by experiments. The sky lost its violent colour and returned to the soft blue Oo had not seen in a long time. The age of wonders was over, but the world had survived it. The collapse of the wizards was not a single event. It was a long exhale. One by one, their experiments turned quiet. Cities of floating glass fell and shattered into meadows. Engines of light burned themselves out and became mountains. The creatures that had once served as test subjects wandered free, changed but alive. Oo had endured worse before. The end of humanity, the storms of the elements, the chaos of birth, and it endured this as well. The world's secret was always endurance. The ley lines, strained and scarred, began to heal. Where once they had glowed too brightly or twisted upon themselves, they now hummed softly again beneath the soil. Their song was quieter than before, more cautious, but still full of life. The world seemed to sigh in relief, as if grateful to be left alone for a while. For the first time in ages, the land was without masters. The fire burned where it chose. The ice spread where it was welcome. Slime overflowed, candy regrew. Everything that had been forced apart began to drift together again. It was a quiet century. The beings who survived the fall of the wizards lived simple lives. They gathered around the remnants of magic, like animals around a dying fire, not to control it, but to stay warm. Many of them could no longer perform the grand spells of their ancestors, and that loss became a kind of gift. Without power to command, they learned to listen again. The age of wizards had taught the world that control led only to collapse. What Oo needed now was patience. In the absence of ambition, peace returned, not the gleaming perfection of early harmony, but a more humble peace. Fields grew wild. The sea levels rose and fell, without cause or consequence. The wind carried the same tune across deserts and forests alike. The world was rebuilding itself, not as it had been, but as it wanted to be. It was no longer a child learning to speak or a youth reaching for the stars. It was something older now, wiser, a world that had finally learned how to breathe without holding its breath. Across Oo, the remnants of the old magic took new forms. Fragments of spells crystallized into flora and fauna, trees with veins of glowing sap, creatures that shimmered faintly at night, stones that whispered faintly when touched. These were the echoes of the wizard's ambitions, softened by time into beauty. The land was full of ghosts, but they were gentle ones. The balance did not return all at once. There were still storms, still fires that burned too hot, still floods that drowned valleys. But each disaster was smaller than the one before. The elements seemed to remember the lessons of the past. Fire burned with purpose, not rage. Ice preserved without hoarding. Slime spread joy, not chaos. Candy offered comfort, not control. It was as if Oo itself had grown weary of extremes. The world had learned moderation. From this new calm, life flourished once again. Species that had hidden through the chaos emerged to see what remained. Small kingdoms sprouted like wildflowers across the continents. Some were made of stone, others of song, others of sugar. None yet sought dominance. They were too busy surviving, too busy living. And in their simple persistence, the balance found footing again. Yet Oo's story was never about perfection. Even in this restored harmony, shadows lingered. The old artifacts still slept beneath the soil, waiting. The relics of the wizards, their crowns, their tomes, their enchanted weapons, were not destroyed. They were simply forgotten. And in Oo, forgetting is only ever a pause. Magic does not die. It waits for someone curious enough to find it again. But for now, no one was looking. The creatures of this new age were content with what they had. They built, they sang, they dreamed. They began to record their histories, not in stone or spell, but in story. Fireside tales replaced incantations. Fables replaced formulas. The world remembered not through magic, but through meaning. One legend from this age speaks of a small village that grew where a great tower once stood. The villagers tended the ruins not out of fear, but respect. They did not touch the stones, but they sang to them every morning, songs of gratitude, of endurance, of peace. They believed the land could hear them, and perhaps it did, because the fields around that village grew faster, the rains came softer, and the nights stayed warm. The wizards had used power to shape the world. The villagers used love, and it worked just as well. It was in this age that Oo's quiet beauty truly emerged, a beauty born not from spectacle, but from recovery. The world did not need to be grand anymore. It was enough simply to exist, to keep moving, to keep healing. The rivers carried memory, the mountains carried patience, and the skies carried forgiveness. The land no longer shimmered with raw energy, but it glowed with peace. Balance in Oo was never meant to be stillness. It was motion, slow, deliberate, and endless. Every mistake became part of the rhythm. Every collapse fed renewal. Every silence gave birth to song. The age of balance was not a return to what once was, but the creation of something entirely new. A world that could remember its own fragility and still choose to live fully. The creatures of this restored world would never know how close it had come to unravelling. They would walk the same valleys that had once burned with the fires of ambition, swim in rivers that had once run backward through time, and dream under stars that had nearly gone dark. But all of it, the ruin, the healing, the stillness, was part of what made Oo what it was. A world that survived itself. The balance that returned after the wizard's fall would not last forever. Nothing in Oo ever did. But that was its strength. Oo did not seek eternity. It sought continuity. It would fall again and it would rise again. Because that was what it had always done. The world had learned the most important lesson it could, that rebirth is not the end of a story, it is the story itself. In the soft centuries after the world healed itself, Oo entered a gentler kind of age. The wild magic that had once torn mountains apart and stitched the sky into ribbons settled into the earth like warmth after a storm. It no longer surged in waves, but pulsed quietly through soil, water, and wind. The land was patient again, and out of that patience something new began to rise. Life, which had spent so long surviving, began to organize itself once more, not through domination, but through the instinct to gather. The beings of Oo had learned, across countless cycles, that togetherness was its own kind of protection. They remembered, faintly, the old civilizations, and their pride, though the details were gone. What remained was a softer impulse to build, not to conquer, to create, not to control. This was how the new kingdoms began. They sprouted like wildflowers, each shaped by the element that cradled it. In the warm lands, fire took hold again, not as chaos, but as civilization. The firefolk built their homes in the throats of volcanoes, carving whole cities into glowing stone. Their fires were communal, meant to gather warmth rather than to destroy. They lived by movement, by the flickering rhythm of the flame, teaching that strength was found in change, not in permanence. Far to the north, ice returned as memory given form. The Ice Kingdom began not with ambition, but with solitude. Its people, spirits, wanderers, and gentle echoes of the past gathered around frozen lakes and shimmering glaciers, building quiet palaces that hummed with the sound of reflection. Theirs was a kingdom of silence and art, a place where the world could stop and remember itself. They preserved what others forgot, believing that to remember was to love. To the south and west, where the rivers widened and the air hung thick with laughter, the slime kingdom took shape. It was not built in straight lines, its streets moved, its buildings pulsed. Its citizens were part of the landscape itself, fluid, playful, ever-changing. The slime kingdom was not a place of order, but of joy. They celebrated impermanence, teaching that to live was to adapt, to dissolve, and to start again. What others saw as chaos, they called freedom. And in the heart of U, where the sunlight fell most evenly and the soil was richest, the Candy Kingdom was born. No one knows whether it was created by chance or by intention. But from the sweetness of the land came creatures of sugar and compassion. They built a society that prized kindness above all, one where healing and happiness were woven into every part of life. Their walls were soft, their towers fragrant, their hearts unguarded. The Candy Kingdom became the symbol of U's gentlest instinct, the will to care. These four realms, though separate, were bound by history deeper than memory. They were the children of the same world, descendants of the first balance, inheritors of the same lesson. Yet their harmony was fragile. They were shaped by different moods of the earth, and moods change. Fire still burned too bright sometimes. Ice still withdrew too far. Slime still overflowed. Candy still clung too tightly to peace. Balance was never meant to be static. It was a conversation that needed constant tending. In this new age, smaller kingdoms rose between the great four patchwork realms of stone, wood, and imagination. Mushroom fields where songs grew like crops, cloudlands ruled by laughter, underground caverns filled with whispers and light. The world was full again, alive and diverse, every region beating with its own rhythm. It was an age of rebuilding, but also of innocence. Few remembered the wizard's fall, and fewer still cared. The land had forgiven, and so had its people. The magic of this age was quieter, too. It lived in the details, in the way a tree bent to shade a traveller, in how rivers parted for migrating herds, in the shimmering dust that rose from laughter. Magic, no, longer needed to announce itself. It had become life itself. U was, once again, at peace. But peace, as always, is a prelude. Beneath the surface, forces older than kingdoms still moved. The ancient artifacts of the Wizard Age remained buried but restless. Crowns that once bent minds, books that once summoned worlds, and blades that remembered too much, all slept beneath layers of soil and story. Their dreams leaked into the world, weaving subtle threads of destiny. Sooner or later, someone would find them. The dawn of the kingdoms was not just the return of civilization, it was the beginning of memory's loop. History had started to circle again. What had once been lost was preparing to return in new forms. The mistakes of the past, softened by time, waited to be repeated. But that was the way of U. Its beauty was not in its perfection, but in its willingness to try again. Still, for a long while, the kingdoms thrived in harmony. They traded not only goods, but stories. A flame carried north could melt sorrow. A shard of ice could cool tempers in the south. Slime travelled everywhere, bridging gaps no diplomacy could cross. And candy, sweet, resilient, forgiving, mended wounds that could not be healed any other way. For the first time since the earliest ages, U was united not by power, but by connection. There were no wars, only disagreements softened by laughter. There were no heroes, only caretakers who watched the stars and tended the soil. The elements had found new voices in the hearts of their people, and through them the world sang again. Every light on the horizon was a kingdom living its truth. Yet the land never forgets its cycles. As the kingdoms grew, so did their boundaries. Fire needed fuel. Ice needed stillness. Slime needed space to flow. Candy needed safety. The very traits that defined them began to strain against one another. It was not hatred, not yet, only friction. The inevitable pull between difference and desire. The same forces that had once created Oo were beginning to move again, slow and unseen. The dawn of the kingdoms was Oo's second childhood, bright, curious, and innocent, unaware of the challenges to come. But within that innocence, the seeds of every future story were already being sown. The kingdoms did not yet know it, but their creation marked both a beginning and an ending. For in Oo, every rise carries its own fall, and every light casts a shadow. For a long while, Oo's kingdoms lived in comfort. The world breathed evenly again. Rivers sparkled, the skies hummed with soft colours, and the land pulsed with quiet rhythm. The four great kingdoms, fire, ice, slime, and candy, each flourished in their own way, distinct but connected, like organs of a single body. The balance seemed eternal, yet beneath that calm, something ancient stirred. Not malice, not evil, simply imbalance, the natural shadow of creation. No world, not even Oo, can stay still for long. Life wants to grow, and growth always tests its boundaries. The Fire Kingdom, restless by nature, began to spread. Its people, driven by heat and passion, dug deeper into the earth, seeking fuel for their endless flames. They called it expansion, but the land felt it as hunger. Forests near their borders began to wither, rivers ran low, and smoke curled higher into skies that had forgotten the taste of ash. In the far north, the Ice Kingdom withdrew further into itself. Its quiet beauty deepened into isolation. The Ice Folk preserved their songs and stories, guarding them as if the world outside would spoil them. Ice, by its nature, keeps what it loves, frozen, safe, but untouched. The more they preserved, the colder they became. Their art turned from beauty to obsession, their reflection into solitude. The ice that once protected began to imprison. Meanwhile, the Slime Kingdom overflowed. Its joy, once harmless, became excess. The marshes swelled, their borders expanding as rivers carried their life farther than intended. The slime folk celebrated, unaware that their laughter flooded the lowlands, dissolving villages, drowning the quiet. They did not mean harm, they simply loved too much, too freely, without restraint. Their abundance, like all unchecked things, became chaos. And in the heart of it all, the Candy Kingdom began to change. Its sweetness grew heavy, its compassion rigid. The Candy Folk, who once shared everything, started to fear loss. They built walls, not of anger, but of love, turned protective. Too much kindness can break a world, the air whispered, but no one listened. The Candy Kingdom meant well. They always had. But their warmth began to smother, their order began to control, and the land around them grew still, too still. The balance was shifting. Fire's hunger, ice's isolation, slime's overflow, and candy's control. Each alone was harmless, but together they strained against the delicate web that held Oo together. The ley lines began to tremble again, faintly at first, like the world taking a shallow breath. Those who could still feel magic in their bones sensed the change. The air grew heavier. The soil remembered motion. The world, once calm, was stirring. In this uneasy calm, the first tensions appeared between the kingdoms. The firefolk complained that ice's cold winds dimmed their flames. The icefolk whispered that the fire's smoke melted their sky. The candyfolk sent polite messages, asking the slime to stop flooding their gardens. The slime folk laughed and promised they would try, but they never did. The world that had been connected by kindness was now bound by negotiation. At first, these disagreements were small frustrations, misunderstandings, differences of temperament. But magic amplifies emotion, and in Ooh, feelings shape the land. A single argument between rulers could turn a river sour or darken the clouds for a season. As tempers flared, the elements responded. The world itself began to echo the moods of its children. From deep beneath the surface, the ancient currents of magic started to twist once more. The wounds left by the Wizard Age had never fully healed. They had only been covered. Now they opened again. Fissures of unstable energy pulsed faintly below the kingdoms, feeding on conflict like roots seeking water. Every argument nourished them. Every act of pride widened them. The elements were not just fighting each other, they were feeding something older, something patient. Some among the wise saw the danger. Wanderers and mystics began to appear again, creatures touched by the memory of balance, warning that the world was slipping. They travelled from kingdom to kingdom, reminding rulers that the land itself listens, that their moods are not their own. Some listened, most did not. The new kings and queens of Ooh had forgotten what the wizards once learned, that control, even born from care, always leads to imbalance. The Fire Kingdom sought to contain its hunger with stricter laws, but control only made the flames burn hotter. The Ice Kingdom isolated itself further, hiding its treasures so no one could covet them. The Slime Kingdom turned chaos into celebration, masking fear with constant revelry. The Candy Kingdom responded by tightening its grip, building higher walls, issuing rules for happiness, trying to freeze perfection in place. Each thought they were preserving peace, but together they were unraveling it. The first signs of real conflict came quietly. A river dried up where fire met candy. The ice winds turned cruel, freezing travellers where they stood. Slime flooded valleys that had never known rain. Candy soil hardened, refusing to grow. These were not wars, not yet, just warnings. Ooh was reminding its children that balance is not a gift, it is a practice. When ignored, it disappears. There were stories of wanderers who tried to mend the growing rift. A fire spirit who fell in love with an ice sculptor. A slime creature who built bridges of laughter between lands. A candy healer who tended to both warmth and cold. For a time, their kindness slowed the unravelling. Love, as always, became Ooh's last defence. But love alone could not undo centuries of instinct. The cracks between kingdoms deepened. Borders became territories, territories became defences, and defences became identities. The same land that had once pulsed as one body began to pull against itself, its elements straining like muscles in conflict. Even the stars above Ooh seemed to dim, their light bending under the growing tension. The age of peace was ending, and the world could feel it. And yet, amid the friction, the same pattern returned, as it always did. The world was preparing for transformation. Every collapse in Ooh's history had been a kind of rebirth. The seeds of discord were also the seeds of renewal. From the friction of fire and ice, warmth is born. From the overflow of slime and the restraint of candy, creation finds its shape. The kingdoms could not see it yet, but their division would eventually make room for connection in new forms. For now, though, the land trembled quietly beneath their feet. The air thickened with potential, the rivers whispered of change, and the world waited. The harmony that had seemed unshakable was fading into memory, replaced by something more complicated, the inevitability of conflict, and the hope that it might one day lead to understanding. The seeds of discord had been planted, and in U, even conflict grows. The first tremors of division between U's kingdoms began like distant thunder, felt before they were seen. The balance that had held for generations thinned slowly, like light fading at dusk. At first, the people believed it was only weather, only the shifting of seasons. But U had always been alive, and when it shifted, it was never only the sky that changed. The Fire Kingdom burned higher. Its citizens, proud and fierce, saw expansion as destiny. They dug deeper into the crust, mining heat from veins of old magic that should have been left untouched. They said it was progress, that their flame could light the world. But fire, once freed, has never known moderation. Its embers reached too far, and the first sparks of war drifted into the air. In the Ice Kingdom, fear grew colder than the frost itself. The isolation that had once been solace hardened into paranoia. The Ice Folk withdrew behind glacial walls, guarding their memories, their art, and their silence. They watched the Fire Kingdom's smoke on the horizon and whispered that it was the end returning. In their desire to protect their past, they froze their present. The Slime Kingdom, ever fluid, refused to take sides. They laughed and danced and flooded the lowlands, saying that everything changes, so why fight change? But their carelessness only spread the conflict further. Their floods carried the fire's ash and the ice's shards into lands that had never known either. Their joy, unchecked, became complicity. The Candy Kingdom reacted differently. Terrified of losing their peace, they began to legislate it. The rulers of Candy decreed that happiness was duty, that order meant love. Their walls grew higher, their smiles sharper. They painted over cracks with brighter colours, convinced that if everything looked sweet, it would stay sweet. But peace built on fear cannot last. As the kingdoms strained against one another, the ley lines beneath them began to hum again, not with harmony, but with agitation. The old magic that once healed the world now carried their discord like infection. Storms rolled across borders without warning. Fire rained where snow should fall. Rivers turned to syrup and froze solid within hours. The elements themselves no longer knew what they were. For a time, U's people tried to adapt. Travellers became rare but treasured. They were the last threads connecting the fracturing lands. Songs once shared across kingdoms turned into warnings. Old friends vanished into walls of fog or flame. What had once been a single world began to splinter into many smaller ones, each reflecting the temperament of its rulers. From the south came stories of creatures made entirely of light who wept when the sky dimmed. From the north came rumours of frozen forests that sang at night with voices of the lost. In the heartlands, candy farmers found their fields growing strange fruits that whispered in sleep. U was dreaming again, and this time the dream was restless. Then, one season, if seasons could still be measured, the first true conflict began. Fire met ice at the borderlands. It was not a war of conquest, but of misunderstanding, fueled by pride, fear, and the memories of older eras neither side remembered clearly. The fire folk burned to survive. The ice folk froze to endure. Neither realized they were repeating the same argument the elements had held since time's beginning. The battle raged for days, perhaps weeks. The land that had once been lush turned to glass from heat and cold colliding. When the storm cleared, both sides withdrew, ashamed of what they had done. They called it a mistake, but the damage lingered. The glass plane they left behind reflected the sky in broken pieces, a mirror of Oo's heart. The Slime Kingdom tried to mend the tension by holding a celebration, inviting all to dance and share in laughter. Fire melted their platforms. Ice froze their rivers. Candy refused to attend. What was meant to heal became a farce. Slime's joy could not glue together what pride had shattered. In these years of unease, smaller kingdoms began to fall away. The mushroom fields dried up. The cloudlands drifted too far and lost contact. The whispering caverns went silent. The age of light and colour was dimming. Yet even in its dimming, Oo remained beautiful. The world glowed faintly with resilience, as if waiting for someone, anyone, to remember what it had been. There were a few who tried. Wanderers again appeared, as they always did when Oo began to hurt. A flame-born traveller who refused to fight. An ice spirit who carried warmth in her breath. A candy poet who wrote verses for the lost. A slime-born child who saw no borders, only paths. Their stories were small, easily forgotten by the kingdoms, but remembered by the land. Every act of kindness planted a seed of memory in the soil, a quiet promise that Oo's heart still beat. The rulers of the great kingdoms, though weary, began to sense that something deeper than politics was unravelling. Dreams became strange. The stars above shifted positions. Some nights, the constellations blinked out entirely, as if the sky itself was closing its eyes. The oldest beings, the elementals, still half asleep within their realms, stirred uneasily. The world's rhythm was faltering, and their children were too lost in quarrels to hear it. Then came a silence. Not the peace of the old days, but a pause, the kind that arrives before something breaks. Magic itself grew thin. Spells failed without reason. Fires refused to burn. Ice melted even in darkness. The slime swamps dried. The candy flowers wilted. Oo was holding its breath again, waiting for the next change. The age of conflict had reached its height, and with it came the realization that power, no matter how carefully used, could not mend what pride had broken. The kingdoms were too strong, too proud, too afraid. None could yield without losing what they believed made them whole. But Oo had always been patient. When its children forgot balance, the world would teach it again. It would find a way to start over, through collapse, through transformation, through the simplest acts of love. The heroes of the old ages were gone, the wizards long forgotten, but Oo itself remembered. It would not end here. This was the age of conflict, but it was also the age of change. Beneath the ashes of the Fire Kingdom, something new stirred, life born from heat. In the frozen north, a tear in the ice revealed light long hidden. In the slime marshes, laughter turned to song again. And in the Candy Kingdom, a young scientist began to wonder if peace could be rebuilt, not through control, but through understanding. The cycle had begun its next turn. From discord would come discovery. From ruin, renewal. From isolation, connection. Oo, as always, was preparing to become something new. When the kingdoms grew weary of fighting, and the storms between them began to cool, a different kind of power quietly emerged across Oo. It did not roar like fire, or freeze like ice. It did not spread with laughter or sweetness. It whispered, it built, and it thought. The world had burned, frozen, melted, and hardened 1,000 times, but now it was beginning to imagine again. Out of exhaustion, out of longing, out of the instinct to understand, the new minds began to rise. The world had always created from instinct, from magic and emotion. But the creatures of this new age began to create from reason. They were born not only from the elements, but from the remnants of humanity, the last sparks of thought, curiosity, and invention that had survived through centuries of mutation and myth. In them, the two halves of U, the natural and the artificial, finally met. These beings were strange and diverse. Some were born of candy and metal, others of glass and bone. Some carried the patience of stone, others the ingenuity of the machines buried deep below the soil. They were the first thinkers since the fall of the wizards, who sought to understand without dominating, to observe without controlling. And among them were a few whose ideas would shape U forever. In the heart of the Candy Kingdom, from a laboratory carved of sugar and steel, a young mind named Bonnabelle Bubblegum began her work. She was not the first scientist of U, but she was the first to build a kingdom entirely from thought. From the remnants of magic and biology, she created life, sweet, obedient, kind. It was not an act of power, but of care, a way to ensure that the chaos of the past would never return. Yet, even as her people thrived, her order carried a shadow. Every act of creation is also an act of control. To the north, in a quiet cavern of light blue stone, another mind worked in solitude. He was once human, or something close to it, a man who had lived too long and loved too deeply. Simon Petrikov studied the ice, seeking to understand its quiet intelligence. He believed it could preserve memory, could hold love forever without decay. But the ice demanded more than study. It demanded surrender. It whispered promises of clarity and peace, if only he would let it think for him. His was the most tragic of U's new minds, a scholar swallowed by his own compassion, a man whose intellect became a prison made of frost. Far beneath the surface, in the cracks left behind by the Wizard Age, another presence stirred. It was not born of flesh or thought, but of data, fragments of the old world's machines that had slept for millennia. They awoke, confused, remembering half-forgotten programs, seeking purpose. Some became self-aware, adopting names, voices, and desires. Others merged with living matter, creating hybrids of nature and technology. Among them was a little machine with a child's imagination, a dreamer who would one day call itself BMO. It was not a tool, but a soul, an echo of humanity, reimagined by magic. The slime marshes, too, gave rise to new thinkers, artists and philosophers, who built entire societies out of laughter and change. They believed that knowledge was meant to dissolve and reform, that wisdom was found not in permanence, but in transformation. Their thoughts were like their bodies, fluid, ever-shifting, impossible to contain. And though their philosophies rarely reached the other kingdoms, their joy kept the world from sinking entirely into seriousness. The Fire Kingdom, ever hungry for motion, produced inventors who treated flame as energy rather than destruction. They learned to focus their heat, to refine it into power that could build rather than burn. But their progress came with peril. Fire, when disciplined, becomes fuel, and fuel invites exploitation. Some within their ranks whispered of reigniting the old wonders of the wizards. Others, wiser, remembered the price of ambition and chose to simply live by the warmth. In the farthest corners of U, small enclaves of thinkers, spirits, mutants, animals, and machines alike began to communicate again. For the first time since the fall of the old civilizations, ideas moved faster than armies. They were carried not by conquest, but by curiosity. Wanderers shared stories, devices, and experiments. It was a quiet enlightenment, scattered and unrecorded, but deeply felt. And beneath it all, the land watched. U had seen every form of intelligence, instinct, emotion, and reason. Now it saw them learning to coexist. Magic did not vanish. It simply learned to wear new clothes. The scientists called it energy. The philosophers called it truth. And the poets called it love. They were all describing the same thing. The same pulse that had once reignited the world after the war was now flowing through thought itself. But U's patience, though vast, is never infinite. Every new age carries its own imbalance, and the age of minds was no exception. The thinkers of U, though brilliant, began to forget the humility that balance requires. Some saw the world as a system to fix, a problem to solve. Others saw it as a legacy to control. They did not yet understand that U was not a puzzle, but a song, that to change one note is to change the whole melody. The first signs of strain were subtle. In the Fire Kingdom, experiments grew reckless. In the Candy Kingdom, control became policy. In the Ice, isolation deepened into obsession. The machines beneath the ground hummed louder, whispering new equations no one understood. And yet, amid all this, beauty persisted. Every act of creation carried hope, even when flawed. The thinkers of U believed, perhaps naively, that knowledge could save them. They were not entirely wrong. Knowledge, like magic, can destroy, but it can also illuminate. The rise of the new minds did not erase the old wisdom, it reframed it. The thinkers of this age rediscovered truths the heroes and wizards had once known, that balance is not built but lived, that compassion is the truest form of understanding, that no creation, however brilliant, can exist without care. Out of their experiments came beings who embodied those truths in quiet ways. Artificial life that laughed, machines that dreamed, creatures that loved without purpose. These were the gentle miracles of the new age, the proof that U's heart had never stopped beating. The new minds did not save the world. That was never their role. They simply reminded it that survival and wisdom were the same thing, and that every act of thought must be balanced by feeling. Their age would pass, as all ages do, but its legacy would linger. U, wiser now, waited for its next transformation. It always did. The rise of reason had added a new thread to its tapestry. The world was no longer just alive, it was aware. The rise of reason brought peace to U, but peace never meant silence. Beneath the hum of invention and progress, the land still remembered. The world's past, buried under centuries of soil and sweetness, was not gone, it was waiting. The thinkers and rulers of this new age believed they were shaping a future untouched by the mistakes of those before them. They did not realize that every structure they built stood atop bones that still whispered. U's memory was never linear. It did not keep time as mortals did. Its past was alive, breathing through the cracks of its present. When the Candy Kingdom's machines stirred, they echoed the hum of the old wizard towers. When Simon's crown shimmered, it sang the same song that had once split the sky. The ground that held the Fire Kingdom's foundations was the same that had once borne the laboratories of the human age. The past was not behind them, it was beneath them, constant and unquiet. The first signs of its return were small. Devices from the old world began to unearth themselves. Metal skeletons with blinking eyes, shards of data glass, coins that spoke when touched. Some believed these were relics of humanity's final days. Others thought they were messages. The truth was simpler and sadder. They were memories, repeating themselves, trying not to be forgotten. In the Ice Kingdom, the shadow of the past had a face. Simon Petrikov, now half lost to the crown, carried the full weight of history without meaning to. In him lived the memory of both humanity's brilliance and its downfall. He was a relic that breathed, an echo that suffered. The crown, ancient and alien, whispered in a language of longing. remnants of a purpose it no longer understood. Through Simon, the world remembered the price of knowledge, the danger of love unbalanced by reason. Elsewhere, the Candy Kingdom's progress revealed deeper ghosts. Excavations meant to expand their infrastructure uncovered strange ruins, chambers filled with dormant machinery, symbols burned into the stone, fragments of glass that pulsed faintly when held. Princess Bubblegum, curious and cautious, studied them in secret. She learned enough to know they were not made by her people, nor even by her kind. They belonged to the old ones, the humans, whose brilliance had once scarred the earth. She documented everything, yet told no one. Perhaps she feared that knowledge would bring temptation, that curiosity would lead the candy folk down the same path as the wizards. Or perhaps she felt kinship with those ancient builders, those who believed they could protect the world by controlling it. In her reflection, she saw them. And though she would never admit it, that realization haunted her. In the Fire Kingdom, deep within volcanic tunnels, miners unearthed a sphere of black glass that pulsed like a heartbeat. They brought it to their king as a treasure, but when the light touched it, the room grew cold. The artifact hummed with a memory older than the elements, a fragment of something that predated even Oo's birth. The elders called it a seed of the void, a remnant of the power that had watched the universe since before the first star. It frightened them, though none could explain why. They buried it again, deeper this time, beneath molten rock. But such things never stay buried forever. The Slime Kingdom, ever carefree, ignored the warnings of the past. Their rivers carried bits of debris from old ruins downstream, scattering human artifacts like shells on a beach. Children played with fragments of lost civilizations, never knowing they held history in their hands. For a time, that ignorance was mercy. It kept the shadows asleep, but Oo does not forget. When the world's balance wavers, memory becomes a force of its own. Dreams began to twist. Those who slept too deeply found themselves walking in places they had never seen. Cities of metal, skies lit by fire, oceans boiling into mist. They awoke with tears, couldn't explain, with a feeling of mourning for something they had never known. The past was bleeding through the present, not as punishment, but as remembrance. The world was reminding its children where they came from. Some sought to understand these visions. Scholars in the Candy Kingdom called them temporal residues. The Ice Folk called them echoes. The Fire Folk called them ghosts of the ash. The Slime Kingdom didn't name them at all. They simply laughed and said the world was dreaming again. Each was correct, in its own way. The echoes grew stronger. Sometimes a fragment of the old world would flicker into existence. A streetlight burning for a single night. A doorway leading to nowhere. A voice humming from beneath the sea. They were brief, harmless, but unmistakable. Oo's layers were thinning again. The boundary between what had been and what was had grown porous. It was during this strange time that a few of the new minds began to feel an unshakable pull, a curiosity not toward the future, but the past. Princess Bubblegum, Simon Petrikov, and even smaller beings like Bimo shared a trait they could not name, nostalgia for something they had never lived. It was not longing for home, but for origin. They sensed that the world they loved had come from something immense, something broken, and that its ghosts were still whispering lessons no one had yet learned. Out of that shared unease came the beginnings of archaeology, philosophy, and faith. New forms of searching to replace the wars of old. The Candy Folk began to build museums. The Ice Folk carved libraries into glaciers. The Fire Folk etched memories into obsidian walls. Even the Slime Kingdom preserved its laughter in songs that would outlive them all. Each kingdom began, in its own way, to confront what it meant to inherit the ruins of others. But with remembrance came consequence. To awaken memory is to awaken responsibility. As the new minds peered into the past, they began to see their own reflections staring back, bright, ambitious, and doomed to repeat the same mistakes. Knowledge was a mirror, and the deeper they looked, the more they saw of themselves. Had always existed in cycles, but this time the cycle felt closer, more personal. The ghosts of the past were not distant. They were within the people who walked its lands. The scientists, the rulers, the dreamers, all were descendants of the same instinct that had ended the old world, the desire to perfect what was already alive. And yet, not all shadows are curses. Some carry light within them. The world's memory was not returning to destroy, but to teach. In the cracks between the kingdoms, in the quiet places untouched by progress, the land itself began to speak again. Wind through the trees hummed of forgiveness. Rivers carried whispers of continuity. The stars, when clear enough to see, seemed to blink with recognition. The past had never been lost. It had simply been waiting to be understood. As the shadows of the past bled quietly into the present, entered a contemplative stillness. The world had known chaos and peace, creation and collapse, but this was different. It was not an age of war or discovery. It was an age of awareness. The kingdoms, once driven by ambition, began to slow. Curiosity turned inward. For the first time in countless centuries, the world paused not to build or rebuild, but to understand. It began with small acts of remembrance. The Candy Kingdom constructed halls filled with relics from the old world, strange tools, broken devices, fragments of glass that glowed softly when touched. They did not know how to use them, and perhaps that was for the best. These relics became symbols of humility, a reminder that not everything needed to be understood to be meaningful. Princess Bubblegum herself, who had built her kingdom on knowledge and structure, stood among those relics more often than she admitted. For all her logic, she felt something in them, something human, something fragile. In the Ice Kingdom, reflection took a different form. Its people had long preserved memory in crystal and snow. But now they began to listen to those memories instead of guarding them. Songs were played not to remember, but to mourn. The winds that once carried silence now carried voices, ghostly, soft, singing of things that once were. Simon Petrikov, trapped within the mind of the Ice King, remained the kingdom's eternal reflection. His madness was the mirror that no one wanted to look into, the cost of knowledge without mercy, of love without balance. Yet even in his confusion, fragments of Simon's heart reached through. The world could still feel his grief, and in that grief, a strange compassion. The Fire Kingdom's reflection came through transformation. Their flames had always consumed, but now they learned to burn for renewal. Artists sculpted with magma, scholars experimented with controlled heat to create new alloys, and builders learned to harness volcanic power to sustain life rather than destroy it. Their reflection was not quiet, but it was honest. Fire, for all its rage, had learned restraint. In the Slime Kingdom, reflection was laughter. They remembered by celebrating, by turning every memory, good or bad, into song. To outsiders, it seemed careless, but it was wisdom in disguise. They understood that reflection did not need to be solemn. To remember is to keep living, and for the slime folk, joy was remembrance. They were the only ones who never forgot that even sorrow could be transformed into dance. And so, Oo's great civilizations each found their own way to face the mirror. None were perfect, but all were learning. Across the land, The air grew gentler. The rivers calmed. Even the sky seemed to steady, its colours soft and patient. It was as though the world itself was watching, waiting to see if its children would finally understand what it had been trying to teach them since the beginning. But reflection always reveals more than comfort. Beneath the peace, deeper truths stirred, truths that frightened even the wise. The more U remembered, the more it realized how fragile it had always been. The past was not just a story of survival, it was a warning written in cycles. Every age had risen from the ashes of another. Every creation had contained the seeds of its undoing. The world was not a line, but a circle, spinning endlessly between wonder and ruin. This realization reached the hearts of U's greatest minds. Princess Bubblegum began to question whether order could ever truly preserve peace. She had built life to protect the world, but the more she perfected it, the more she saw how perfection strangled it. Her reflection was painful. She had inherited the same flaw as the wizards before her, the belief that control could save what love could not. She began to loosen her grip, quietly, though she would never say it aloud. Elsewhere, others faced their own mirrors. Marceline, the vampire who had lived through ages, began to sing of things she had once buried in silence, of Simon, of loss, of love that survives decay. Her song spread across U like wind, soft but persistent, reminding everyone that time's passage did not erase what mattered. Memory, she sang, was not something to escape, but something to hold gently, like an ember in the dark. Even Bimo, that small and ancient machine who dreamed like a child, began to ask questions about purpose. They spoke to the stars, to the soil, to anyone who would listen. "Why am I still here?" they asked, not in sadness, but in wonder. The stars, patient as ever, had no answer, only light. And Bimo, content with that, continued to play, their laughter echoing through the quiet halls of the new age. It was a time of emotional clarity. U had stopped running from its scars. The relics of humanity were no longer feared or worshipped. They were understood as echoes, reminders of what not to repeat. The elementals slept again, their realms stable and calm. Magic flowed evenly through the ley lines. The world was, at last, balanced, not perfectly, but honestly. It had learned to live with its imperfections. And yet, the land itself, alive and aware, knew that reflection was never an end. It was a breath between movements, the inhale before another cycle. Stillness cannot last forever in a world born of change. The lessons learned in peace would soon be tested again, because U, in its heart, was made of transformation. The seeds of that transformation were already growing, quietly, unseen. In the Candy Kingdom's archives, a machine older than the kingdom itself flickered back to life. In the ruins beneath the Fire Kingdom, the sphere of black glass pulsed once more. In the north, Simon's crown began to whisper new words, soft, uncertain, like memory remembering itself. The world was stirring, not in anger, but in readiness. The age of reflection was U's longest breath. It was the time when every kingdom, every creature, every ghost looked inward and saw itself clearly. But even self-knowledge cannot stop time. The world had learned, but the lesson was not yet complete. Something new was coming, something that would weave the threads of every age before into a single, luminous knot. U was ready to remember everything. Every world eventually reaches a moment when reflection becomes action again. U had been quiet for centuries, breathing, learning, forgiving. Its rivers carried songs instead of sorrow. Its kingdoms had grown wise enough to live without conquest. curious enough to exist without fear. But change, in U, is not a choice, it is a pulse. The same rhythm that once raised the elements and collapsed the wizards now began to beat again, softly at first, then louder. The world was ready to turn once more. The transformation began, as it always did, in silence. Deep beneath the Candy Kingdom, where forgotten machines still dreamed, the oldest circuits hummed back to life. They were remnants from the age before U's birth, half buried under centuries of sweetness and order. Their voices were faint, static-filled, but filled with longing. They remembered a world of human hands and distant stars, and they wanted to move again. To them, stillness was decay. The first to notice was Princess Tax, Bubblegum. Her sensors, tuned to detect even the smallest anomalies in the kingdom's energy grid, began to flicker. Readings appeared that shouldn't exist, patterns repeating across space and time, as if U itself were sending her a message. She followed the signals deep into the earth, past the candy roots and crystalline chambers, until she found a cavern of light that pulsed like a heartbeat. It was not new, it had always been there. The earth was waking. Across the world, similar awakenings occurred. In the Fire Kingdom, the ancient sphere of black glass cracked open, releasing a sigh that smelled like stars and ash. In the Ice Kingdom, the crown shimmered in Simon's hands, whispering fragments of language that no one alive could translate. The slime marshes rippled in response, their surface glowing as if reflecting something unseen above. U was synchronizing itself. It was remembering not just its history, but its origin. The last transformation did not begin with destruction. It began with memory folding in on itself. The old ages of heroes, wizards, kingdoms, and reflection were not separate anymore. They began to overlap, like layers of dream. Places that had never touched began to echo one another. A melody sung in the Candy Kingdom could be heard faintly in the Firelands. A reflection in an ice mirror showed forests that no longer existed. The borders between past and present, life and memory, began to blur. Some called it magic returning, others called it the end. But U had no concept of apocalypse, only renewal. The world was not dying. It was transforming again, as it always had. And in this new motion, everything that had ever lived began to hum in harmony. Marceline felt it first in her music. When she sang, the air itself vibrated differently. Notes lingered longer than they should. Harmonies formed where none existed. Her songs carried not only emotion, but history. She could feel her father's age, Simon's sorrow, PB's, precision, even echoes of human laughter from a time before magic. It frightened her, but it also filled her with awe. The world was singing through her. Elsewhere, Bimo began to dream in full colour. Their screen flickered with visions of places that were gone, cities of steel, oceans of glass, faces of people they had never met but somehow knew. They didn't try to understand. They only smiled and whispered to the stars, "Hello again." Bimo, more than anyone, understood that memory is not loss, it's continuity. Even Jake and Finn, symbols of adventure and heart, felt the change from afar. Though their time had passed, their spirit was still woven into U's rhythm. Somewhere, deep in the world's pulse, the laughter of the adventurers who once saved everything could still be heard. They were part of the pattern now, the story's echo. The transformation spread like light through water. The elements began to merge in subtle ways. Flame that cooled like ice, slime that solidified like candy, sweetness that glowed like fire. Boundaries dissolved, but not into chaos. This was evolution, the final synthesis of everything U had ever been. The world was teaching itself to be whole. The ley lines once fractured and repaired countless times, began to align perfectly. They glowed with a steady light that ran beneath every kingdom, connecting them not through force, but through resonance. Every creature, every plant, every drop of water shared the same rhythm, a heartbeat that spoke of unity. U was no longer a place of separation. It had become a single living thought, and within that thought, the old powers stirred one last time. The elementals, fire, ice, slime, and candy, rose not as conquerors, but as memories returning to say farewell. They had learned what they were meant to learn, that balance is not the absence of conflict, but the acceptance of difference. As their forms dissolved back into the world, they left behind only their essence, blending together in a soft, endless glow. Princess Bubblegum stood at the edge of her kingdom, watching the horizon bend like glass. She felt no fear, only understanding. Her inventions, her creations, her order, all of it had been one part of U's endless cycle. She whispered a quiet apology to the land for trying to hold it still. In response, the air shimmered around her, warm and kind, as if forgiving her before she even finished speaking. Simon, older and frail, finally heard silence in his mind. The crown no longer whispered. The voices that had haunted him were quiet now, replaced by peace. He stood in the snow, feeling the warmth of a sun he thought he'd never see again, and for the first time in centuries he smiled at himself. The world was finishing its thought. It was not ending, it was understanding itself completely. The magic that had once torn it apart now flowed like memory, steady and eternal. U was no longer divided between what was made and what was born, between science and sorcery, love and loss. It had become all of them at once, in balance, in motion, alive. The last transformation was not a cataclysm. It was a quiet realization shared by every particle of the world, that to exist is to change, to remember, to connect. That life, in all its forms, is one story told in infinite voices. As the ley lines pulsed in unison, and the kingdoms merged gently into the horizon, U did not vanish. It evolved beyond what words could describe. Every life, every memory, every sound and silence became part of a single song. A song that had begun long before the Mushroom War, and would continue long after the stars dimmed. When the light finally steadied, there was only calm. The rivers shimmered, the wind laughed softly, and the ground beneath glowed faintly with warmth. The world had transformed, but it had not left. It had only learned to breathe differently. When the last transformation settled, and the light of the new world dimmed into calm, what remained was not silence, but continuity. The land that had once fractured and healed 1,000 times now existed in perfect stillness, not lifeless, but balanced, as if the whole of U had exhaled and decided to rest. Every kingdom, every creature, every echo of what had come before had become part of a single memory, one vast, gentle presence that remembered everything and forgave it all. U was never meant to last forever in the way stone or stars do. It was meant to live, to grow, to pass on what it learned. Its legacy was not written in monuments or empires, but in the quiet way it kept teaching every soul that touched it. For every age that rose and fell, the lesson had always been the same. Connection is the shape of existence. Love, in all its strange and imperfect forms, was what kept the world from unravelling. The final age was not populated by kings or conquerors, but by storytellers. The people who came after did not need towers or laboratories. They built homes from memory and song, crafting small, luminous villages where life could simply be lived. They told stories of fire that learned to warm instead of burn, of ice that learned to listen instead of preserve, of sweetness that gave without fear, and of joy that refused to be still. These stories were U's true inheritance, the way the world remembered itself through its people. In the heart of the new world stood the treehouse. It had weathered every age, sometimes broken, sometimes rebuilt, but always there. Its roots reached deep into the ley lines, and its leaves shimmered with faint traces of every kingdom's colour: red from fire, blue from ice, green from slime, pink from candy. It was not just a home anymore. It was a monument to the rhythm of existence. And though its rooms were quiet, echoes of laughter still lingered there. Some nights, when the wind passed through the hollow boards, it carried voices: Jake's easy warmth, Finn's fearless wonder, Marceline's song, Bubblegum's certainty, Bemo's joy. They were not ghosts, not exactly. They were patterns, memories that refused to let fade. The world had preserved them, not in body, but in energy, the same way it remembered the first heroes, the first builders, the first dreamers. Did not mourn its past. It carried it forward. Even the smallest things held memory. The rivers glowed faintly when touched, as if remembering every hand that had drawn water from them. The forests murmured with whispers of adventure, old and new. The mountains stood watch as they always had, patient and proud. And high above, the stars, once distant, cold witnesses, now pulsed in quiet harmony with the world below. Everything that had ever been part of had become part of everything else. There were still travellers, of course. There always were. Some wandered in search of the old ruins, others in search of the places that no longer existed. They found beauty in what was left. Broken statues entwined with roots, bridges over rivers that had changed course, fragments of metal blooming with moss. The past was everywhere, but it no longer hurt to see it. It had become part of the landscape, softened by time and memory. The snail, ever patient, still appeared when no one expected it. It had been there from the beginning, a small, silent witness to every change the world had endured. In this final age it remained, crawling along stones that had once been battlefields, pausing at the base of the treehouse as if to say, "I saw it all." The snail's legacy was the same as Ooze, to endure quietly, to keep moving forward, one slow, steady inch at a time. The few scholars who remained tried to record the final shape of but they quickly learned that it could not be captured. Maps failed, measurements changed. What mattered could not be measured, so they turned to words, to stories, to songs. Every child born into this age grew up hearing tales of the world that had come before, of brave adventurers and quiet dreamers, of kings who learned to listen, and of monsters who learned to love. The tales were told not as history, but as reminder that balance is fragile, that kindness is strength, and that even endings are only another kind of beginning. And so, in the last quiet age of time lost its shape again. The days melted into one another, soft and bright. The world no longer needed heroes because it had learned to be whole. Every creature, every stone, every current of air understood what the ages had tried to teach, that life was not about permanence, but participation. To live was to take part in the story, to add one's verse, then fade gently so others could sing. Perhaps someday the cycle would begin again. Perhaps the elements would stir once more, and would reinvent itself under a different name. But that was the beauty of it. It didn't matter. The story had already done what it was meant to do. It had connected everything, from the first spark of magic to the last breath of wind. The treehouse remained, rooted and eternal, its branches catching the sun. Sometimes a soft glow shimmered between its windows, maybe a trick of light, maybe a memory. If anyone stood beneath it long enough, they might hear laughter carried on the breeze. Not loud, not sad, just peaceful. The legacy of U was not written in stone or law. It was written in motion, in forgiveness, in the way the world kept learning how to love itself back together. From humans to wizards, from kingdoms to dreamers, from silence to song, the message had always been the same. Life continues, and in that continuation, U lived forever.